Max hot, brake set, throttle crack.
You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake. Welcome back. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for watching. If you're joining us on the podcast, we will have some visual aspects here. I'll try to keep it as audio friendly as possible, but just so you know, there is a YouTube channel that you can watch all of this. This is our continuation of the series of the Private Pilot Airman Certification Standards. We're diving deep into the ACS. We've done parts 1 through 4, and we're starting up on 5. So this will be in Area of Operation 1, Task E, which is National Airspace System. Now, there is a slight change of format that I'm going to do with this one, and something that I kind of realized that I should have realized earlier is that a lot of these tasks and areas of operation are common between multiple different Airman Certification Standards documents, meaning that you're going to have to demonstrate knowledge of the National Airspace System, in this case, at the private pilot level, at the commercial pilot level, and the CFI level. So rather than do 3 different video series that cover the national airspace at those different levels, I'm going to try to cover it all in this one video. The important thing to remember is if you're doing it at the private pilot level, this will be to a level of understanding that you're going to be able to comprehend. I'm not going to overteach that, right? But if you're doing it at the CFI level, I'll sprinkle in some methodologies that you might want to use as an instructor to teach this topic. Of course, the commercial level is about the same as the private pilot level. But if there are any differences, I'll point those out. The point being, whether you're studying for your private or you're an instructor in training or you're already an instructor and you're just looking to do some professional development on a YouTube series like this, then I think this will be helpful. So I'm going to jump into the National Airspace System Task E, which is an Area of Operation 1 at the private pilot level for now, but we're going to jump over to the commercial and CFI and see if there's any differences there. All right, so starting out with Area of Operation E, again, it's titled National Airspace System, and we have references. I've got the ACE guide pulled up here, and each one of those references is hot links. So if you just want to click on it, it'll take you to the underlying document. Like I've said before, those references aren't incredibly useful because they just take you to the main document. So for instance, the 8083-3 is the Airplane Flying Handbook. It doesn't even tell you which chapter to go into. So the ACE guide kind of helps target that a little more granular level and take you to the appropriate chapter at least. So the references, they are what they are. The objective of this is to determine the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with the National Airspace System in operations under VFR as a private pilot. So that's the objective at the private pilot level. Let's see what you're going to have to do as the commercial pilot level. So we're going to go over to the commercial ACS, Area of Operation 1, Task E, just the same. And the objective here is to determine the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, skills associated with the National Airspace System, operations under VFR as a commercial pilot. Sound familiar? The only word difference in that objective is commercial or private. So it's basically the same task in the commercial pilot. It's recycled from the private pilot. Whatever the commercial pilot level understanding of airspace means versus a private pilot level, I'm not really sure what the FAA was getting at there. I've got my ideas, and we'll talk about some of those as we go on, but it's pretty basic. Okay, now let's go to the CFI Airman Certification Standards. That's an Area of Operation 2, and it is Task G. So this one is determine the applicant understands the National Airspace System, can apply the knowledge, manage associated risks, demonstrate appropriate skills, and provide effective instruction. So that one is significantly different than the private and commercial pilot level. So as a CFI, you're expected to be able to teach this, right, at the appropriate skill level. And we also have some different knowledge topics here that we'll get into. So back to the private pilot. What is the goal here, right? I've read through the objective. It's basically to be able to understand the airspace. Now, the way your examiner is going to go through this is they're going to give you some sort of scenario-based problem for you to work through an airspace issue, right? And typically this is going to be related to what the last series was over, and that was your cross-country flight planning. So your cross-country flight plan scenario should have you fly from your home airport to another airport for the purposes of a check ride. And what the examiner will probably do is choose a route of flight that takes you through a few different kinds of airspace. And so that's setting up the scenario essentially. And they're going to look to you to know how your requirements are going to change based on the airspace that you're in. Okay, so before we get into that scenario-based training, let's see the knowledge topics, risk managements, and skill items required for this task. So for the knowledge topics, remember we have to cover at least one knowledge topic, at least one risk management, and we have to do all of the skills. So for the private pilot level of airspace, we have 4 knowledge topics. Knowledge topic 1 is airspace classes, associated requirements, and limitations. So I have a link here that takes you to the Airspace Classification System, and that is out of Chapter 15 of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. So Chapter 15 of the PHAC has all the information on like the different types of airspace. So that green button there takes you directly to Chapter 15 there. Knowledge topic 2 is chart symbols. Again, this takes you to Chapter 15 of the PHAC for your chart symbols. I'll also show you another thing in there. That's a chart user's guide. There's a link for down at the bottom of the page. Knowledge topic 3 is special use airspace, or SUA, special flight rules area, or SFRA, and temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs, and other airspace areas. So this green box, again, takes you to Chapter 15 of the PHAC, and also takes you to an ECFR page, ECFR Part 93, which is the Special Air Traffic Rules, or SATR. We'll dive more into that here in a little bit. And then the last knowledge topic is special visual flight rules VFR requirements, or special VFR. So that has a link to 91-157, which is your special VFR minimums. So those are the 4 knowledge topics that you'll be expected to demonstrate knowledge of during the check ride. And remember, the examiner just has to pick one of these at a minimum, but they can also incorporate any questions that you missed on the written knowledge test. So if you were taking the private pilot written knowledge test, these codes over here to the left, for instance, this first one is PA, that stands for private. 1 is your I, that's the area of operation 1. E is your task, E, which is National Airspace System. And then K1 refers to this first line here. So you might have missed a question regarded to airspace classes, associated requirements, and limitations on your written exam. So that means the DPE has to ask you a question regarding that in the check ride. Now, they can use that as their one knowledge topic, or they can use it in addition to the plan of action that they normally have. So they may have you do 2 knowledge topics here. As I said before, usually you're going to cover more than one knowledge topic just in the course of doing a scenario-based lesson, because there's several different pieces of knowledge that you're going to demonstrate on this scenario. But for now, we'll just say, hey, you have to do at least one. So those are our 4 knowledge topics here. Let's run over to the commercial pilot side to see if there's any differences here. And we can see that there really isn't. There's the same 4 knowledge topics for your commercial level there. And then lastly, as the CFI, in the technical subject areas, task G, that's your National Airspace System in the CFI, there's actually 5. And the only one that we added was knowledge topic 4, is your currency of publications. And so I've got a red box around this one that takes you to the dates of latest editions page for the FAA. And it basically shows all of the current and next edition dates for every different type of chart that you could imagine that the FAA publishes. So that's a pretty useful link there that isn't in the other areas of operation. I'm not sure why, because that is pretty important even as a private pilot to know, when your publications might be non-current. So if you have the ACE guide jumping over to the CFI side of things, you can add that. Maybe I'll add a link to that on the private pilot level in the next version. That'd be pretty easy to do. So back to the private pilot level. We'll go to National Airspace. We're down to our risk management. Now remember, we have to do at least one risk management item. And in this case, there's only one, risk management R1, and it is various classes and types of airspace. Probably not the most clear objective here, but I guess what they're saying is, mitigate the risks associated with the various classes. So how you might handle risk of flying in Class G versus Class Bravo. Again, this is going to be tested in a scenario-based format, which we'll get into when we get into the skill sections here. But that's, it's pretty straightforward. There's only one of those. And if we go to area of operation E in the commercial, it's the same exact one. And then back to our CFI in task G, we still only have one risk management item. So at the private pilot, commercial pilot, and CFI level, all of them only have one risk management, and it is managing the risk between the various types of airspace. Okay, finally, we're going to get to the skills section. Now remember, this is true for everything in the ACS, no matter what you're doing. You have to do all of the skills. And so when I'm preparing someone for a check ride, what I'll suggest that they be able to do is look at each skill for each of the tasks. And if they can demonstrate proficiency in each one of those skills, then they're ready for the test, right? That's essentially the test, is the skill section. In demonstrating proficiency in each of these skills, you're going to end up demonstrating knowledge of at least one of the knowledge areas, and you're going to demonstrate a lot of the risk management skills as well, as long as you're answering these skills in a scenario-based format, which I keep bringing up scenario-based format. I promise I'll bring it all together here when we do the skills. So let's read through them first. So skill 1, identify and comply with the requirements for basic VFR weather minimums and flying in particular classes of airspace. Okay, I've got a link here to FAR 91-155, and this is your basic VFR weather minimums, and it's the chart from the FARs. Okay, and this is our whatever mnemonic that you use. I think it's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 or something. I don't use that typically, but anyway, your 3 statute miles of visibility, or if you're in Class G, it's your 1 mile clear of clouds. All of those cloud clearance requirements are listed in 91-155. All right, so there's a link to that directly on that line. Next is our skill 2, correctly identify airspace and operate in accordance with associated communication and equipment requirements. And then there's links specifically to Class G, Class E, D, C, and B. Now each of these are purple links, and the purple links denote that that's to an ECFR regulation versus a blue link, which would be to the AIM. So Class G, for instance, is defined in 91-126. So each class of airspace has their own individual FAR where you can kind of read about it and on what the FARs have to say about that class of airspace. And then skill 3 is identify the requirements for operating in SUA or within a TFR. Identify and comply with special air traffic rules, or SATR, and SAFR operations if applicable. And that takes you to 91-93. And 91-93 we've already talked about in the knowledge topic area. That's your area for special air traffic rules. Now there's more to follow on this that we're going to bring up ForeFlight, because if you're using an EFB specifically ForeFlight, you get a lot more, I guess, enhanced situational awareness on special use airspace. Okay, at the bottom here we have kind of 3 things that I would recommend. One is the free airspace course. This links you directly to a wings course that the FAA produced on how to use airspace. Let's just open that up for a second, because I think it's a really well-designed course. And I recommend that if you're going to do a check ride anytime in the future, or you're just wanting to brush up on airspace, this is a really good course, and it's free. It covers all the basics, right? And it's also, the FAA created this, right? This is straight from the FAA Wings website, the fastteam.gov website. So it has your course objectives here. We can see the chapter list over here. We've got 8 chapters. Another thing that's useful is at the very bottom of I think the first chapter, it has a download link where you can do a text-only version of this in a PDF. And so it's somewhere either in the introduction. I should have had this pulled up. Okay, here it is. We've got the airspace and special use in TFRs. It's a PDF-only version. So this is the PDF of the actual course that you can just download directly, and you don't have to access the online course. You can just have it in PDF format. That's pretty good to save to your iPad. You can put it in your document section. I may even wind up adding that to the ASCAD in the future, but for now, it's on this course and you have access to it. At the end of this, you do a review and exam, and if you log into your Wings course, you'll get Wings credit for this as well. So this will count for 1 credit of your ground credit for one of those basic phases of Wings. Moving over to the CFI-ACS, you'll also find, surprisingly, there's no difference at all either. It's the same 3 skill sets that we have to demonstrate at the CFI level. Again, the CFI level, we're worried about, can you teach these 3 skills? So let's go back to the private and think about just the basic core building blocks of this and how I'd handle it in a scenario. And then we'll talk about that. Really, at a commercial level, it's basically the same, but I'll maybe give you some tips as a CFI for how you could teach this. Back to our private pilot level, we're in the national airspace and we need to comply with these 3 skills. So like I've said before, we're going to use scenario-based evaluation or scenario-based training in order to teach these 3 different things. So we're going to pull up ForeFlight here for a second, and we're going to build a quick flight plan. So I'm here at the Russellville Airport today doing my videos. So that's going to be my place where I'm going to start from. Now, if I'm designing a scenario-based evaluation of a pilot that was taking their check ride here at Russellville, I would want to pick a route of flight that's going to take them through some different types of airspace, right? And I've done this on previous videos. A really good one that's pretty challenging could be down here at Destin. So we're going to go to the DTS airport. I'm going to add that to route. So in the last episode, I talked about how I would actually go in here and design a route of flight. It's not going to be a straight line, right? I'm going to use those pilotage and dead reckoning skills and kind of zigzag along from visual point to visual point. But for the purpose of this demonstration, we're just going to leave the straight line in here. Now, configuring ForeFlight is really important as well. I'm going to turn off all of the different layers. I don't want to see radar or anything right now, but I do want to see NOTAMs and TFRs. That's really important to have NOTAMs and TFRs highlighted here because those are key parts of this airspace, right? Knowing when a TFR is active or knowing when a MOA is activated or a restricted airspace. All of that's really important. So I want those layers turned on, and ForeFlight's going to help me if I have the aeronautical layer selected. It's going to help show me, hey, this is ready to go. All right, so I have ForeFlight configured here of my route of flight, and now I want to make sure that my route of flight is actually correct. And I can see here now that I'm planning on cruising at 24,000 feet. That's not going to happen in the travel air. So I'm going to change this to, we'll just go to 4,000 feet. Okay, and since I'm going eastbound, let's go ahead and make that correct. I'm going to go VFR easterly. I'm going to go to 5,500. Okay, so at 5,500, ForeFlight is automatically going to start highlighting the airspace that's going to conflict with me. And I can also see this by going to my profile view. I can see, for instance, Little Rock, that I'm going to clear Little Rock's airspace by a few thousand feet. But if I were to, see how the Little Rock Class C looks right there. If I lower the altitude bar to conflict with the airspace, now look how Little Rock airspace, the Class Charlie, kind of lights up and becomes I guess a thicker color there. And you can clearly see that, okay, we're going to actually intersect that Class Charlie. So it's kind of a support that ForeFlight offers you. If you're using ForeFlight as your EFB, it'll show you what airspace you're going to fly through. Now, again, we're planning on flying at a higher altitude, so we'll move this back up to 5,500 feet. So we're going to clear Little Rock's Class Charlie. Down here, we've got a NOTAM that's active. So this active NOTAM, if we tap on it, a single tap, it's going to tell us what that area is. So in this case, it's going to be the Meridian 2 military operating area. It's active from 8,000 to flight level 180. So this is highlighted as being active, but we're not going through it. So it's not a conflict. If we were to use the rubber band feature and just pull us over into this MOA, just to demonstrate here, and then take it up to, let's say we're going to go to 8,500 feet. Let's see if ForeFlight gives us any information about that. So up to 8,500. Now if we go up, you can tell that there's a slight change in the coloration of that MOA, showing us that we're going to conflict with it. And here in the profile view, we can see that we're going to conflict with it there. So on a single short tap, it pulls up the name of the MOA, that it's active, and the altitudes that it's active in, right? Now, if we long press on this MOA, it's going to pull up more options. So we're going to hit details next to the Meridian 2 MOA, and that is going to give us the communications for it. So we know that Memphis Center on 124.4 is going to be the controlling agency we need to talk to for deconfliction of the MOA. So in a scenario-based format, what I may ask about this is, hey, can we fly through this MOA? Knowing the altitudes that that MOA is activated at and being able to confidently say, well, sir, at 5,500 feet, we'll change this back down, 5,500 feet, we're going to have plenty of margin underneath that MOA. And also I can just monitor 24/4 for the frequency on flight following to make sure that there's no conflicts that I'm unaware of. And on a normal course of flight, we're going to be outside the lateral confines of that MOA anyway. So that answer that I gave there is kind of a good risk management type of answer to give, right? I've given my answer. I've clearly shown that I know how to use the tools here. I know how to three-dimensionally define that military operating area. And then I know how to deconflict by talking to the right frequency. So I know that there's this thought of, checkride prep, where when you're in a checkride, you want to answer the shortest way possible of what the examiner is asking. Don't give a long-winded answer. And I can kind of understand that to some extent, in that you don't want to start digging yourself a hole and going into things that are totally unrelated to the question. But I think giving a thorough answer like that, so when I ask, hey, what does that MOA mean there? And you give me just, well, a MOA is a military operating area. Okay, well, that's the right answer. But now I have to ask, okay, well, how would you figure out what the frequency is for that? And I can long press on ForeFlight and it gives me the frequency. In this case, it's 124.4. Okay, so you see how we're just going from question to question, and it's almost a rote type of scenario here. It's not scenario based. Where in a scenario, you could not only point out that, hey, the meridian MOA is a factor. Here's how I've managed my route of flight, and I've done my planning for frequency mitigation or frequency planning to make sure I'm on flight following to avoid that, right? I've answered that now kind of an in-depth way. I've not just answered the direct question of, well, what is a MOA, and defining what MOA stands for. So slightly different. I would suggest you give an answer similar to that rather than give the minimum answer that the DPE is asking for. And it's just going to make that question and answer, kind of that back and forth, go on for much longer. Okay, let's talk about some other options here. Now, as we get closer into the destined area, the airspace starts getting a lot more complicated fairly quickly. Looking at the profile view, this is a great option of ForeFlight. We can make that tray larger, and we can see we've got a lot of different airspace that we're going to go through. One of these is a restricted area. So restricted area R2915 alpha, we're going to fly through. It's from surface all the way up. So that's a rather large restricted area. Now, knowing that you can fly through a restricted area if it's cold, right, that's going to be something that I'm going to want to hear as an instructor or as an examiner during the check ride. A restricted area being there doesn't mean that you can't fly into it. It just means that when it's active and you're not a participating aircraft, then you're not allowed to fly into that restricted area. A lot of these restricted areas around the country exist, they're published, but they're not always in use, right? We have one here locally at Little Rock. There's actually 2 restricted areas over by the Little Rock Airport, very close to in close proximity to the North Little Rock Airport. They're active, I don't know, I'd say 5 or 6 times a month maybe, but most of the time they're not. So you don't have to avoid those restricted areas, but you do know how, or you do need to know how to contact the controlling agency of that restricted area to see if it is active. So we're going to make this tray go away here. We're going to long press again on the restricted area here, hit details, and it'll give us Jacksonville Center on 124.475 as the controlling agency. And it gives us our controlling agency as well as a phone number down here. So there's actually a phone number we could call in flight planning. This is a commercial phone number. It belongs to Eglin Air Force Base. We could give them the approximate time that we're arriving to see if that's going to be a factor, and they'd let us know. All right, but there's something else going on down here at Destin, why I chose that. And for that, we need to look at the sectional. So let's, I guess, rewind a little bit here, because so far I've just been looking at the aeronautical layer. And this is something that I suggest a lot of people do, because I think the aeronautical layer, it's responsive. The text gives you more or less information depending on your zoom level. And for most purposes, the aeronautical layer is plenty good for planning. But in some instances, you do want to look at the sectional. And what I would recommend you do is do a lot of your planning in aeronautical, but then as you're double checking your plan, pull up the sectional to see if there's anything you're missing, because occasionally, and this is one of those occasions, the sectional gives you a little bit more data than ForeFlight does. So we can see that the destined area in this case is white. It's changed colors slightly here, right? We've got a white, it goes from this green to white, and if we zoom out, we can see down here we have a text box in the Gulf of Mexico called Special Air Traffic Rule, FAR Part 93. Remember that from our knowledge topic. We have FAR 93. And then it has a blue arrow and a white arrow. This is basically a key showing us how to enter this special flight rules area. And if we go further down into the Gulf, we can see we actually have this little map here that's showing us how we should enter from the north or how we should enter from the east or west. Now, it doesn't give us any instructions from entering from the south, because if you're entering from the south, you're going to be over the Gulf anyway. It's not a factor. But most people, especially in GA, are going to be coming from the north, east, or the west. So we have three options. And these three options actually deconflict us from the restricted area 2915 alpha. So here, going back to our line, that straight line to destin isn't really going to work in this case. The blue lines are clearly showing that we need to come in from Crestview. So we would use a rubber band feature, we would move our route of flight up to Crestview, and we would add the Bob Sykes Airport, or that's the Crestview Airport, K Charlie Echo Whiskey, to our flight plan so we can approach destin directly from the north. And then, so we're following the blue arrow here. We look down at the blue arrow and it says clearance required prior to entering north-south corridor. Contact Eglin on 124.05. Recommended north-south routings 3,500 feet or above. So that's the training, or that's the way we're supposed to enter the destined area. Now, this is a great example of Part 93 airspace. So that's our Special Air Traffic Rules or Special Flight Rules area, SATR or SAFR. Those are our two different kinds of airspace here. So what I'm going to do is zoom out real quick, and ForeFlight has a newer feature that makes this easier to see. So we're going to zoom all the way out, and we are going to turn on the US VFR flyway. All right, so these flyway charts are also a type of Special Flight Rules area or Part 93 airspace. Notice how they're centered around the larger cities in the country. So pretty much all the big class Bravos will have a flyway chart, and that flyway chart also has Special Flight Rules areas inside of it. Let's go over to Phoenix. So zooming in on the Phoenix flyway chart, we're going to turn off our aeronautical layer in this case, turn off NOTAMs and TFRs so we can read this flyway chart pretty clearly. These purple arrows right here in the center of the screen, these actually show a Part 93 Special Flight Rules area that transits right over the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. So as a VFR aircraft, there's actually a procedure that you can do to fly directly over the runway VFR on a north-south routing. And so that would work great if you were up at the north side of the Phoenix Class Bravo, let's say at Deer Valley, and you wanted to go down to Chandler, or you were headed to the stack to go do some instrument practice. You could use that Special Flight Rule area, and you can designate that here on the chart. Now, another way that we can find that is in the document section of ForeFlight. So let's go to the document section of ForeFlight, go to FAA and our fly charts here. So that's where we actually find the kind of the PDF version of that chart that we just had pulled up. And over here on the left-hand side, it has some more text for our VFR transition routing. All of that is listed there. That's and a key here. What it's not, this stuff is not going to show up on the map page. So if you pull up the map page, see how it has just a cutaway of the flyway chart? So that's why I wanted to show you where to find that in the document section of ForeFlight, because it's going to have much more detail. So the point is, if you're taking a check ride in one of these areas, you're going to want to know how to fly these or find these flyway charts and the data that's on there. And it's something that's commonly missed on check rides is people don't understand where these are. They've only been looking at sectionals or a tack chart, and they've missed the flyway charts. And even if you're not taking a check ride in one of these areas, this is a really good thing to look at, because your scenario, your evaluator may ask you to fly to one of these areas where this is at. Okay, so that's in the FAA folder in the fly charts. So next we're going to go to the FAA and visual chart supplement. So this is in addition to the flyway charts, we're going to have our visual chart supplements. So for Phoenix, we're going to have the Phoenix supplemental. So let's look at the Phoenix supplemental and find our north-south routing. This is the east-west route, VFR only, the VFR transition route. It has to be ATC cleared, and then it gives you the actual text and frequencies that you're going to use to get approved to fly over the Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. So this is essentially an expanded view of the flyway chart that we already saw, but it just has a little more granular data, a little bit higher resolution, and is a little more clear. Okay. All right. Next, if you're going to operate in a special flight rules area, more than likely the FAA has some sort of training on that, especially Washington, D.C., or in our case, Pensacola. Both of those have special training courses on the FAA website. So let's pull that up real quick to show you how to find that. All right, so if you go to the FAAsafety.gov website and you go to activities, this is probably the best way to find it. If you just search for SFRA, it's going to pull up several courses. So one of these is the DC SFRA course, and one is the New York SFRA course. Those are both free. There's also a course here for Bravo Buster, Ventures in and around the National Airspace System. That's a free course there. That might be a good thing for you to take. And then some of these cost something as well. So we don't necessarily want to see that, or we don't necessarily want to have to pay money to take these. But if you really wanted to dive deep in, let's say, the Hudson Corridor simulator training, it looks like there's a company called SimTech that will take you through that training. Okay, now let's search for Eglin. So the Eglin, here's our Destin Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, Part 93 operations. This is ALC course 47. So if you were going to fly to Destin, that would be a course that you really need to take prior to going, right? That course is going to step you through all of the processes on how to fly into Destin safely and comply with the Part 93 airspace rules there. So if you were to take a check ride with me, I would expect you, and I give you that Destin scenario, I would want you to have that completed. Now, as an instructor, you need to know that that course exists. So when you have a check ride, or you're a student that's taking a check ride with me or another examiner that asks you to go to Destin, you know that, hey, there's a training course for that. Or if you're up in the Northeast or even anywhere close, I might be an examiner that, let's say, is based in Kentucky, and I want you to fly to Washington, D.C., or one of the airports that lies in the D.C. SFRA. I would expect you to take the training course that's on the Wings website. So make sure when you get that scenario assigned by your examiner that you search the FAA website, the FAST team website, to see if there's a training course for that specific area. I'd want to take that before the course and bring your completion certificate to show the examiner that, hey, I've managed the risk by going to this particular airspace by taking this course and being smarter about it. You're kind of meeting the risk management requirements of this task by taking that type of course. Okay, back to our ForeFlight. So with the sectional pulled up here, we can see that we're going to fly to the Crestview Airport and fly south. Now, looking at Crestview Airport here, I can see that that's a Class Echo, but it has this hashed mark around the outside, and I can see that on the sectional and on the aeronautical view. You can see the aeronautical view, I think, shows it a little bit easier, and we also have these helpful little texts on the sides of the circle here, the hash circle, and the text appears on the inside of the circle, and it shows me that it's Class Echo from the ground to 17,999 feet. So that's class Echo to the surface. And we can compare that to, let's say this airport, the Bruton Municipal, which is 12 Juliet. It is basically what I would call a class G airport. It doesn't even have a ring around it. So we know that it's class G at the surface. If I pull up my sectional, it probably has a shaded, there's our shaded magenta line around it. So I know that the class Echo only goes down to 700 feet in that location. And we can compare that to this airport called Waynesboro Municipal. It's 2 Romeo 0. It has no shaded magenta around it at all. So we know that it's not a class Echo. It's a class Golf from the surface all the way up to 1200 where Echo starts. So that's the type of level of knowledge I would expect at the private pilot level, is just knowing what airspace we are sitting on the ground and when are we going to transition into a different area. So where that might come up is, okay, we're cruising at 8,500 feet and we're just north of the Waynesboro Airport, or excuse me, we're at 5,500 feet. So 5,500 feet just north of the Waynesboro Airport. And as you're flying along by Waynesboro, you have some sort of malfunction and you decide that it's time, or it's about enough malfunction where you need to land pretty soon. So you're going to decide to divert into the Waynesboro Airport. And the cloud clearance requirements would be different than if I'm below 1,200 feet. Once I go below 1,200 feet, I'm now in class Golf airspace. So that's pretty good knowledge level at a private pilot. And then knowing how to find out more about Waynesboro. Obviously, it wasn't part of my plan to land there. So maybe I don't have the NOTAM, so how would I gather that in flight? Well, I know that if I tap on the airport with the aeronautical layer pulled up, I can go to info, I can find the flight service that's nearby, I can find all the frequencies that I need from an airport, and really importantly, I can find my chart supplement. So tapping on that chart supplement, I'm now going to have information about the runway, right? I know how long it is, I know what type of surface it is, I know if I have PAPIs. In this case, I see the Waynesboro Airport for both runway 2 and 20 has PAPIs. And we've got some trees, we've got a displaced threshold and a railroad. Okay, so I've got PAPIs there, I've got fuel, I've got 100 low lead and Jet A. What other information do I have here? I see that it's attended, I've got wildlife here, I've got a couple of phone numbers that I can call, and an airport manager. Obviously, I might need those when I get on the ground, but in the air, I'm not going to be using those. And then communications, I've got the CTAF. Also up at the very top, if it was any non-standard type of pattern, that pattern would be listed there, as well as the pattern altitude. So in absence of a pattern altitude, I know that it's going to be left-hand traffic patterns at 1,000 feet AGL for a piston aircraft, right? That's the baseline that's talked about in the Aeronautical Information Manual. So that might be a scenario that pops up of how would I expect you to make use of that airspace knowledge. Okay, going back here, let's look at Little Rock, because Little Rock is our class Charlie. So going over class Charlie airspace, I might ask, well, what type of equipment would be required for you to do this flight? Would we need any specific type of transponder? Would we need ADS-B, anything like that? So I would expect you to know that we need ADS-B to fly over class Charlie. If we're going to fly underneath the class Charlie or outside the lateral confines of it altogether, we wouldn't need ADS-B out, right? But in this case, we're going over class Charlie at 5,500 feet, so we would indeed need ADS-B. We would also need a Mode C transponder kind of by default, because in order for the ADS-B to work, it has to have some sort of transponder to feed it that data. So in many cases, all the cases that I can think of, where you need ADS-B, you're also going to need a Mode C transponder. Now, if I give you some sort of scenario that required you to divert into Little Rock's airspace, I might simulate that with some sort of malfunction that causes you to divert. You're up with flight following, and they tell you to, fly a vector of 090 direct to the Little Rock Airport and contact tower. So in that case, are you cleared to enter the class Charlie? So we might bring up that discussion of, in order to enter the class Charlie, I have to have that two-way radio communication. That has to involve me hearing my call sign, not just being talked to on the radio. And that's different than a class Delta airport, where I just need to establish that two-way communication, right? It doesn't matter if they use my call sign or not. If they acknowledge me on the radio, two-way communication is established and I can enter that class Delta. That's not true with the Charlie. I have to hear my call sign to enter the Charlie. I also have to have that Mode C transponder, and I have to have ADS-B. So those are two things that I would expect to hear there. Now, I've been kind of shooting from the hip here on what skills that we're demonstrating, but let's just see. In this basic scenario that I've talked about here, have we demonstrated all three skills, or have I tested all three skills? So identify and comply with requirements for basic VFR weather minimums in the particular class of airspace. Yeah, we've talked about the cloud clearance requirements for each of those. And then correctly identify the airspace and operate in accordance with associated communications and equipment. Yep, we've talked about the equipment required for class E, G, C. We haven't talked about B. We'll save that for here in a second. And then skill 3, which is identify requirements for special use airspace, SATR, SAFR, TFR. Yeah, I went into detail on how to find information about SATRs and SAFRs in Part 93, all that using ForeFlight here. So what we haven't really talked about is a Class B airport. So first of all, how to identify Class B? That's the baseline of, well, we would see the blue lines here. So we're going to go down to MSY, which is Louis Armstrong. So the New Orleans airport there at Louis Armstrong. I've got my different layers of Class Bravo. What type of equipment do I need to enter there? Well, obviously I need my Mode C transponder. I need ADS-B. That's now called out on the sectional, which is really nice. Up until a few months ago, it just had Mode C. Now it says Mode C and ADS-B out. So we have to have both of those within 30 nautical miles. That's our Mode C/ADS-B veil, 30 miles away from the airport. Okay, so in order to penetrate that, I have those two equipment requirements. In order to get inside of Class Bravo airspace, I also need to have explicit permission. So not just the two-way radio communication established. They don't just need to use my call sign. They need to say cleared into the Bravo. Now this brings up an interesting discussion. I've heard about it on the Discord channel a couple times, and that is, let's say you're on flight following, you're VFR, you're not IFR, you're on flight following, and you receive a vector that's going to put you inside of Class Bravo airspace. The problem is that ATC doesn't always, sometimes they get really busy with flight following. They've given you this vector, let's say it's a vector for traffic. You know that it's going to take you inside the Bravo, but you haven't heard the magic words of you're cleared into the Bravo. So there's a little bit of a discrepancy here. And what I would recommend is that you politely, as best as you can, tell ATC to verify that you're cleared into the Bravo. And so how that might sound, if I'm on a vector and they're really busy, I might say November 677 Quebec, confirm cleared into the Bravo. Now they're probably going to come back maybe a little frustrated that, yeah, I gave you that vector, you're cleared. That's on them. And what I'm trying to do is I want to get it on the tapes that I actually requested it, and I want to get it on the tapes that they said that I was cleared into that. Now this happened to me down in Houston several years ago. I was VFR flight following to an airport inside of or underneath the Houston Class Bravo. ATC held me up higher, so I couldn't get underneath the Bravo. So I was going to penetrate the Bravo. I was on flight following, but I'd never gotten my clearance in. Now I'm VFR, right? I'm not on an IFR flight plan, so it's not like I'm automatically cleared. I'm on this heading. And so what I do is just pull the power back and I do a 360-degree turn because I just wasn't clear. They were so busy. I'd never gotten clearance into the Bravo. I did a 360-degree turn. I made my polite request saying that I confirmed I was cleared. They came back a little frustrated and said, yes, you're cleared. So I continued my flight into the Bravo and descended down eventually out of it. It wasn't a big deal. Now that might not have been the right answer. I'm honestly not exactly sure. I've heard it both ways, that yes, you do need to hear it, or no, you don't. This might be a good kind of opposing basis question. I'm sure they've gotten it before. Probably should have looked that up before I talk about it here. But I just know that, hey, that's a concern there. And that might be a way that you manage the risk of, if you're unclear, don't enter the airspace. Just do a 360. As long as you're doing standard rate, clearing the area, you're not going to hurt anybody. You may frustrate the controllers a little bit, but I would rather frustrate the controllers and stay out of the airspace than bust airspace, cause a loss of separation inside of that Bravo. And that's going to be a much bigger deal than me just doing a 360. All right, so we've covered essentially all the classes of airspace in our scenario. Notice how this scenario doesn't give you a good way to talk about the Bravo. So we may have to exit out of the scenario and I'll just ask a question about operating in Bravo airspace. So sometimes it's kind of difficult to find a scenario that's going to take you through every type of airspace, including the SATR and SAFR. So in this case, I would rather highlight the SATR and SAFR operations at Destin than highlight the operations at a Class Bravo. Honestly, operating Class Bravo is pretty easy. It's very tightly controlled, so it's not that difficult. It is quite busy, and the controllers can be quite busy, so that aspect of it is difficult. If you've done your training in the North Texas area underneath the DFW Class Bravo, you know what I'm talking about. Lone Star Approach can get really, really busy, and that can be a little intimidating as a newer pilot, talking to them, deconflicting all of that. All right, so we have talked about all 4 knowledge topics, the risk management, and all 3 skill areas. Now remember, they're the same at the private pilot level, the commercial pilot level, and the only thing different at the CFI level is we added a knowledge topic which discussed the expiration of the currency of publications. So that's there in knowledge topic 4. The only resource that I haven't really talked about, but I've put it in here in the ACE guide for you to take a look at, and that's the chart user's guide. Now, the Aeronautical Chart User's Guide, like I said, it's updated quite frequently. It's a pretty long document, so it's 137 pages. But just scrolling down randomly, I'm going to go down to, we've got page 83. So page 83, it happens to be IFR stuff. It gives you reference numbers for each specific area. In this case, it's talking about multiple MCAs at a NavAid and how those would be communicated to you in the chart format. So anything that you need to know about any FAA chart is going to be located in this Aeronautical Chart User's Guide. So that's why I included a link on this skill specifically for the ACE guide. So if there's a symbol that you don't know, you're going to be able to find it in here. Now again, it's 137 pages, so you might have to dig around a little bit, but you're going to be able to find it in this document. That's kind of the go-to guide if you have any questions on one of the charts that you're looking at. All right, so we covered how, we've got the 4 knowledge topics, the risk management, and the 3 skills area. I also gave a demonstration of how I might ask this on a scenario-based evaluation. Now remember, from the last episode where we're talking about cross-country flight planning, the cross-country flight planning bleeds directly over into this, right? So you may not even know that you're being evaluated on airspace when you're describing your route of flight to the examiner, right? That route of flight that you're doing for area of operation, so your task D, that's your cross-country flight planning. When you're explaining that, you may be showing proficiency in task E, which is your national airspace system, because just naturally talking about, well, the reason I chose to do this turn here is to avoid this MOA. And that MOA is owned by this agency, and as long as I stay below 8,000 feet, then it's not a factor for me anyway. And when you get down to Destin, hey, the reason I went to Crestview is because on the sectional, I see that this is a special air traffic rules area. I took the test on FAAsafety.gov, and I'm going to make the north route or north-south route, and I'm going to contact Eglin Approach on this frequency. And I learned by taking that course that there's these visual call-out points that I'm going to be expected to see as I transit over Duke Field and Eglin before I land at DTS, right? That's a kind of a longer explanation, but those are naturally going to come up when you brief your route of flight. The other thing that's going to come up probably is your weather information, because a great deal of your VFR cloud clearances is going to depend on the weather information. So another layer that might be helpful when you're studying for this is, again, pull up just aeronautical. And one of my favorite layers for decision-making support here is not the flight category layer, but my ceiling. So the ceiling layer gives me the same color codes as my flight category. So that green, blue, red, and pink gives me all that information, but it also gives me a number. And that number corresponds with the lowest ceiling that's driving that, pink dot in this case. Let's say up here near Topeka, we've got the Philip Billard Municipal right now. And it just updated. Let's go to Branson. So KBBG right now is showing red and 8. So I know that 800 feet would be far. So if I tap on that, I can see that, yeah, it's overcast at 800 feet. So I know that BBG is IFR right now. So I may ask, well, does that mean that you could fly there VFR at all or not at all? If you were an aircraft and you were on the ground at Branson, and let's say you just wanted to go up here to the PLK, that's the Graham Clark downtown Branson, could you make a short flight in VFR conditions from BBG up to PLK if you didn't have your instrument rating and the ceiling was 800 feet? So let's think about that. What we're getting into, you probably noticed, is the special VFR. So that special VFR tells me that I can comply with the normal cloud clearance requirements as long as ATC gives me permission to do so. So in this case, it's a very short flight. Let's look at the visibility here. I've got overcast 810 statute miles visibility. So what I would be asking from ATC if I wanted to do special VFR is take off, and instead of remaining 500 feet below the clouds, which is normally required in Class Delta, I could fly right at the base of those clouds. So in this case, the area around the BBG airport is what I would consider sparsely populated, right? We could pull up the sectional, and the sectional has the areas of yellow that you see around cities. Now, I've heard that people incorrectly assume that, okay, everything's sparsely populated. If it's densely populated, those are marked with yellow on the sectional. And that's not exactly correct. A densely populated area could be something that's outside the yellow, right? It's a little subjective there. You know, it could be an area of a beach, right? If you imagine a beach in the summertime down in Destin is going to be densely populated with people there on the beach, but you may not have a yellow area there because the yellow area, what it's demonstrating, actually, let's pull this up. All right, so if we pull up our chart users guide, we can see that yellow areas show populated places, and it also approximates, it doesn't actually say in the chart user guide, but it approximates what the light pattern would look like at night there. And there's actually also a method behind the font that's used to demonstrate that. So a large font would be cities. So in case of St. Louis, it gives an example. Population more than 250,000. Cities with, it gives, if it's less than 250,000, it'll be slightly smaller font, and then less than 25,000, an even smaller font. So if it's just a small circle, there's no yellow tint, so it's considered a small population. That is a different definition than the densely population from the FAR 91 that tells us our min and altitude requirements. So a little bit of a rabbit trail there, sorry, but we're just trying to think of, is 800 feet, flying at 800 feet AGL, is that going to be enough to get us from Branson over to our Graham Clark downtown? So in this case, we might be at 700 feet AGL. We're over a relatively sparsely populated area, and we're also setting up for a landing. So in that case, we don't have to abide by the min altitude requirements as long as we're in the process of landing at that airport. So all this culminates into us asking for special VFR to take off out of Branson, even though it's calling IFR weather minimums, or IFR weather, with 800-foot overcast ceilings. We could take off, remain clear of clouds at 700 feet with the special VFR clearance, and fly over to Graham Clark, enter the pattern, and land there. We haven't broken any FARs. We might not have done a standard approach, right? But pattern altitudes aren't specified necessarily by the FAAs, just the direction of the turn. So if we go over, the last thing I might want to check here at Graham Clark is our chart supplement here. So we can see that Graham Clark downtown, we have information about runway 12 and 30, and I don't see any notations here about a specific pattern altitude. So if we were to stay at 700 feet from that one airport to the next airport, we would be able to do that, I think, and probably do it safely. Now, that's safely with me doing it at my experience level versus you at maybe a private pilot or student pilot level. May not recommend that. Obviously, some aircraft do this very often, and the aircraft we associate most with special VFR clearances are helicopter traffic. So that helicopter traffic needs to be able to get from point A to point B, even when the ceilings are pretty low, because they rarely get below 100 feet AGL when they're operating within the city. So if 800-foot ceilings, it's not really going to affect them at all. But even flying at 200 feet AGL, they're not going to be able to maintain that cloud clearance. So in that case, they may want to get the special VFR. Now, I might change this scenario slightly and say, okay, well, what about at night? So at the private pilot level, you would have to answer, well, unless I have my instrument rating and the plane is certified and current for instrument flying, then I can't do special VFR at night, because obviously that's increasing the risk quite a lot there. Anyway, that's our special VFR discussion. Going back to our National Airspace System, again, we've covered each one of these skills. We've covered all the knowledge topics, and we've covered the risk management. Again, there's not a big difference between the private pilot level, the commercial pilot level, and the CFI level. It's just your ability to teach this as a CFI, right? That's the main difference, is you want to be able to transfer this knowledge into your student's head using scenario-based training, and ForeFlight, I think, would be the best way to do that. All right, the last thing we've really yet to talk about is special VFR requirements. We talked about where you can find some of the cloud clearance requirements. Those links are all in the FARs and here on the ACE Guided course. But as far as a scenario-based format to evaluate your ability to understand when and where you might want to use special VFR, what are the limitations of that, basically how to do it, right? That's the next thing that I want to go into. So here at our private pilot level, this is going to be in our knowledge topic K4. So this is one of those scenarios. It may not come up in the actual scenario, so it's going to be a trigger point that I put into the scenario somewhere, saying that, okay, let's say that we're, going from this field, and in this case, I'm going to pull up ForeFlight here. So if you're listening along, sorry, this is kind of more of a video-based thing. But what I'm going to do in ForeFlight is I like to pull up, turn off my sectional layer, and turn on my ceiling layer. And this is going to give me the same color coding as my flight category. So that green, blue, red, and pink for VFR, marginal VFR, IFR, or low IFR. So finding an airport just somewhere nearby that has either a marginal VFR or a kind of an IFR. So I like this red number here, this 800. So this 8, what that designates is it's red, so I know it's IFR. So I know it's below 1,000 feet AGL for the ceiling. And the 8 tells me it's 800 feet. And we can tap on it just to verify. We tap on Branson here. We can see it's overcast at 800. But the visibility is 10 statute miles. So let's say for our scenario here, we want to fly from Branson, KBBG, to KPLK, which is just about 6 miles, it looks like, to the north. So in this case, we're a VFR pilot, we're on the ground at Branson, and we want to reposition our aircraft to the downtown airport. We'll just assume that all the weather is great, the visibility is great, there's no convective activity over us, it's just a low ceiling, and we want to reposition that aircraft. Could we do that? That might be the scenario. And the correct answer is, well, it depends, right? Because if it's at night, in this case, and we don't have an instrument rating, and we're just a private pilot, then we can't do special VFR at night. But if it's in the day, we can talk to Tower, and we can request special VFR from the BBG airport up to the PLK airport. So we'll do that. We'll fly at 700 feet, and that puts us 100 feet below the clouds. Now, normally in class Delta or Echo airspace, we would need to be 500 feet below the clouds. But in this case, we're only 100 feet above the clouds using that special VFR clearance. And in this case, we're 700 feet above the ground, and we're in a sparsely populated area. So that's okay as well. We're not breaking any of the FARs here, right? And also, basically, as soon as we get up to our climb, we're in a position where we need to start our descent into the downtown airport. One last thing we could do is look at the PLK airport and see if there's any requirements in the airfield diagram or the chart supplement to see if the chart supplement dictates any specific traffic patterns. So it would say TPA and give some restrictions there. In this case, it doesn't. So our traffic pattern altitude, normally it's 1,000 feet AGL. We're coming in slightly below that, but there's not a published traffic pattern altitude. The suggested traffic pattern altitudes of 1,000 feet AGL for piston aircraft. That's not necessarily a regulated item by the FAA. It's a suggestion. Remember, the only thing that the FAA regulates with traffic patterns is the direction of the turn. So in this case, it doesn't tell us that it's right traffic or anything like that. So we're going to make left-hand traffic to land on either 12 or runway 30. And we'd be able to do that all under special VFR conditions as long as ATC approves us for that special VFR flight. Now, we wouldn't be able to do that as a student pilot, but we would as a private pilot. We wouldn't be able to do it at night unless we had an instrument rating and our aircraft is capable of instrument flight. So that's a little bit of a kind of a side adventure that we would add onto our scenario in order to evaluate your special VFR privileges and limitations as a private pilot. As a commercial pilot, that might change because now you have special VFR capabilities at night more than likely, because most of the people that take their commercial exam also have their instrument rating already. And then as a CFI, of course, I would expect you to have both knowledge, understanding, and ability to teach how a private pilot or commercial pilot would use special VFR in this scenario-based format. But that's a quick scenario of how I might evaluate that during the check ride. All right, so we've covered all 4 knowledge topics. We've covered the risk management topic, and we've covered all 3 skill areas for the private and commercial. And remember, the only difference between the CFI there's absolutely no difference between private and commercial. The only difference in CFI is we had the additional knowledge topic for the currency of publications. So that pretty much covers everything in task G and covers everything for this episode. So I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. I hope you continue to find these useful. Stay tuned. We're going to cover task F, which is performance and limitations, for the next episode. So thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.